And I know there've been a lot of questions in light of some state changes that have occurred. So first this morning, I'd like to introduce our president, Randy Crone, for a few opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. And welcome to Indiana Farm Bureau Wetlands Seminar. And we're glad to have you on here. Hopefully you'll take away a few nuggets of knowledge here today that might help you in your operations. And part of the gist of this, or the reason we're doing this seminar, is during the General Assembly last year, Senate Bill 389 made some changes to the way Indiana looks at wetlands. And so I think all of us were concerned about how people interpret it and what they might do. And I think as I travel the state, farmers want to do the right things. And we're just trying to help you make sure you know what the rules are and you abide by them and follow the protocols you need to be following. Because the last thing we want is somebody think they can, drain some wet area or do something and then be in violation and jeopardize farm payments, crop insurance, or different things. So there's a lot of tentacles to these rules and the laws. And so that's the gist of what we're trying to do here, is just make sure everybody understands what the rules are. So I just say thank you to everybody. Glad to have you. Look forward to the presentation. And Jeff, back to you.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks for joining us. A couple of housekeeping items this morning, and then I'll introduce our guests. For the chat, feel free, if you have questions, which we'll take at the end, feel free to put those in the chat, or feel free to text me. I'll drop my number in the chat if you have something specific. So you can submit your question a couple different ways. I'm at 317-273-9244, 317-273-9244, and that's into the chat. So we'll do questions at the end, but we'd like to start the day with our guests from USDA. Today with us, we've got Shannon Zazula, Indiana State Resource Conservationist with NRCS, Albert Tinsley, State Compliance Specialist with NRCS, Stephanie Alexander, State Chief Program Specialist, Conservation Compliance with FSA, and Kim Hamilton, State Program Specialist. They'll kick off the first portion of our program, and then we'll have Sarah Keller, a Regulatory Specialist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you all for being here today. Don't forget to join us also next week, Thursday, August 26th, when we have a similar program with IDEM and DNR. We look forward to having them as well. But at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our guests from USDA. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jeff. We really appreciate the invitation to come here and speak to the Farm Bureau members, and which most of you are likely our clients as well with the United States Department of Agriculture. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Shannon Zazula, and I'm with the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Service. And with me on screen, you can see my co-presenters. I'll be doing most of the talking, but they will be here to help answer any questions you have. So thank you for having us, and we will want to dive into this. So as Randy mentioned, things change, laws change. You all have questions, we all have questions, but we're here to remind everybody that just because one law happened to have changed regarding wetlands, there are others still in place. And so that's what me and my counterpart from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is here to help you understand today. As Jeff mentioned, next week we'll cover the state laws with you, or IDEM and DNR will cover the state laws with. This is the United States Department of Agriculture's law regarding wetlands. And we want to make sure that we're all on the same page as things are changing out there across the landscape and keeping you in compliance and eligible for our programs. So first of all, what is there's two of them, and we want to make sure that we don't forget this. Today, we're going to focus.
Hey, Shannon, you're cutting out just a little bit on us.
Okay, how about now?
Got you back.
Okay, I'll just repeat what I said, just to be safe. So the Food Security Act has two provisions: the highly erodible land provisions and the wetland conservation provisions. Today we're going to focus on the wetlands, but we want to remind all of our farmers out there the highly erodible land is also a requirement for USDA program benefits. So the wetland provisions, in a nutshell, it prohibits a USDA client from planting on a converted wetland or converting wetlands for crop production. And we will kind of go into some details there to make sure we understand what that means to you. Who does it apply to? Pretty much any producer who participates in any Farm Bill program administered by the Farm Service Agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Risk Management Agency. So you can see a list of the programs down there. As you know, if you've been farming very long and participating in USDA programs, our acronyms change, our programs change. However, these provisions apply to all the programs as they come and go. You can just see some lists there, all the way from federal crop insurance to loans, commodity programs, and the conservation programs jointly administered or independently by NRCS and FSA. So again, if you are receiving Farm Bill program benefits on your farm, these provisions apply to you. Now, who do they not apply to? Well, anybody who's not participating in our programs. And we do have some farmers who elect to not participate in our programs, and so these provisions do not apply to them. So it is a more or less a voluntary, if you will. You can choose whether you participate in our programs or not, but if you do participate, then you must adhere to these requirements, okay? So how do you comply with HEL and wetland provisions? First and foremost, each year you go to the local Farm Service Agency office and you report your crops, and you also, if you know it or not, you self-certify that you are in compliance with these provisions. And that's on a form called the AD 1026. Again, I wouldn't sweat memorizing the form number. Your local USDA Service Center employees can help you with that. But this is where you report to USDA that you are farming in compliance with the Food Security Act. And you can see it listed here. Again, you're agreeing not to plant an agricultural commodity on highly erodible land without doing so according to an approved system that keeps erosion within tolerable limits. And then the last two bullets are the ones that apply to wetlands. You agree to not plant or produce an agricultural commodity on a converted wetland, or convert a wetland that makes the production of ag commodities possible. Now that one's a kicker. We want to make sure we understand what that means. We'll go into more detail later, but it's pretty obvious if you plant a crop on a converted wetland, that's very obvious that that's an action that you did. However, you are allowed to manage your wetlands on your farm, but if you manipulate them to the point that an agricultural commodity could be produced, that is in violation of the law. And so we'll kind of get in a little more detail on that, but there's a fine line there. We want to make sure we're all on the same page of what that means. So what happens if you do plant a commodity on a converted wetland or convert a wetland to the point that an agricultural commodity could be produced? If you are found in noncompliance, you pretty much are forfeiting your USDA benefits. And that's not where we want to be. That's where we're here to talk to you today, making sure that if you have a need to do some work in an area that it may or may not be a wetland, that you know the process to follow with USDA to make sure that activity could be permitted, or if you have, or not permitted, allowed, or that you may need to have other business plans to manage that property, that land. And the key here too is that this applies to your entire operation. If you're found in non-compliance, it doesn't just impact the land that is the wetland. Let's say you have a half-acre wetland and you violate the Food Security Act on that piece of ground. It's not just that half acre that's impacted; it's your entire operation. So that's pretty big. As we know, a lot of our good farmers here in Indiana participate in multiple programs, and that could be a lot of money that you are foregoing by violating these provisions. So that's where we want to make sure we have frequent communication. If you have any plans, then you do not have a current determination, we need you to go into that USDA Service Center and make sure you get the right answers so that you can manage your farm to remain eligible for programs. Okay. Again, I'm talking about the USDA Food Security Act now. My counterpart, Sarah, will talk about the Clean Water Act. And there are differences. And that's why we want to make sure that you understand those differences. But there are some similarities. For example, what is a wetland? All wetlands, whether it's regulated by the Food Security Act, Clean Water Act, or Indiana state law, every wetland has three factors. It must have hydric soils, which is a soil that has been formed and formed under long-term saturation with water. It'll have hydrophytic vegetation, which is vegetation that likes to grow in wet soils and in water. And then finally, hydrology, or water. So again, three factors. A site needs to have water. It needs to have vegetation that likes living in water. And it has to have soils that were formed in long-term under saturated water conditions. You can see on your screen here, this is a wetland. Again, when we think of wetlands, we might think of the Everglades. If you're down from Southwest Indiana, you might drive by Goose Pond. Those are what we call obvious wetlands, right? But most of our wetlands that are under the jurisdiction of the Food Security Act look like this picture. They're typically wooded here in Indiana, and they may not have water year round, but they do have enough water in the early part of the growing season to meet this definition of these three factors. So again, if you have woods on your farm and you know it's not up in the uplands, it very may well be a wetland, and you should ask or consult with USDA before doing any work in that. Again, other similarities between the USDA law and other laws is we do use the same reference materials. These are national and or regional in scope. We have plant lists. We have hydrology indicators. We have hydric soils guidance documents. All of us use the same guidance documents. So in essence, we should be able to identify a wetland consistently. However, when it comes to the individual laws, that's where the final decision of what is a wetland under the law may differ. And that's where we're going to spend our time here today. So what makes a USDA Food Security Act wetland different from other laws? Well, it's pretty much three key factors. I'm trying to focus you all in on three key factors each time here, so you can kind of get a feeling for why USDA may give you a different answer than the U.S. Army Corps or IDEM or IDNR on your farm. First of all, for the USDA Food Security Act, three key factors are: number one, the date of December 23rd, 1985 is unique to our law compared to other laws. And that makes a big difference on USDA program benefits versus other jurisdictions that the Corps or our state partners may have. It also only applies to the growing of commodity crops. Again, if we identify a wetland on your farm and you are not planning to grow commodity crops on that land, then the Food Security Act does not apply to you. Again, the other laws may, but the Food Security Act does not. And when I say commodity crops, we're talking corn, beans, the typical agricultural commodities that we grow here in Indiana. But that does not apply to other farm business decisions, such as buildings, fence construction, those are not growing crops. So those activities do not fall under the jurisdiction of Food Security Act, so long as the rest of your farm is managed according to the provisions. Okay. It also only applies to USDA program benefits. So again, if you are a farmer who does not participate in USDA programs, then these factors do not apply to you. The Food Security Act does not apply to your farm. You can manage that land however you want. However, the Clean Water Act or Indiana state law may have a different interpretation of what you can do with those wetlands on your farm. Okay. So we're getting a little more detail on these so we all understand each other. So first, I'm going to walk you through the process. So if you're like, okay, I rely on farm bill programs, I grow agricultural commodity products, I want to make sure I stay eligible, just like Randy mentioned. We want your farm to be eligible for these program benefits, and we want to make sure that you can receive them. So if I'm scaring you, I hope I'm not scaring you, but I hope I got your attention. So if you think this is important to your farm, I want to make sure that you follow these steps to make sure you remain eligible throughout the life of that farm. Step number one, check and see if you already have a determination. If you already have a determination, then you don't need to contact USDA so long as you manage those properties according to the labels that you have on your determination. And when I say a determination, again, we have a form. It's called the CPA 026. On your screen, you can see an example of one. This is our newest form. We started doing this work back in 1985. The form has changed. So even if you have an older form, that could still, and you manage your farm according to it, you're in good shape. But if you want to change something and manage your farm differently than what those labels say, that's when you need to contact USDA. Along with that form, you should also have a map. And on that map, you should have labels of your farm and the land that you have a question on. So for example, here's a woods next to cropland. We've identified a W, which is a wetland, right there in a pocket of that woods. But we identified the rest of the woods as NW, or non-wetland. The adjacent cropland is labeled as prior converted and non-wetland. PC is prior converted. And again, that means something to the Food Security Act. One difference between the Food Security Act and other regulations is we do not grant permits. You know, the Clean Water Act and state law is more of a permitting process. Ours is more of a labeling process. We will give you a wetland label, and then based on that label, we'll tell you how to manage that farm to stay in compliance with the Food Security Act. For example, here's what you will also get with your form and map is a definition of these labels. And again, you can make this decision on your own of how you can manage those lands without contacting USDA. Again, if you have this wetland, or if you have this non-wetland, and you decide you want to do something with that land, you can read this and says no restrictions unless manipulation would convert adjacent wetlands. Okay, that's a decision you have in hand by USDA that you can go about doing whatever, where there's no restrictions on what you want to do. However, you get down to that W, and you can read that wetlands are not manipulated. Okay, so you may not do anything in that wetland and to make agricultural commodities possible, nor plant an agricultural commodity on that land without being in violation of the Food Security Act. Now, if you have desires or plans to do something in that W area, that's when you would want to contact the USDA Service Center and run your plans by the local staff, and they will help you make the right decision. Or better yet, if you don't do anything to that W area, you are in good shape. There's no chance of you being in violation if you stay away from it. So that's kind of how this is designed to work. So first and foremost, check your records. You don't have to come into the office. You don't have to call the office. You don't have to wait, so long as you have a determination on the land in question and decide to abide by the authorized maintenance activities as you have listed on your form. Okay. So if you do not have a determination in a wetland label on the land in question, now you should contact your local USDA Service Center. And I say, if needed, you will fill out that form that we mentioned at the beginning, the AD 1026. And again, our local service center staff will help you with that. I say if needed, because you may have purchased the farm recently, or even a long time ago, and you may not have these forms. However, our local USDA Service Center may have them. So first thing we'll do is check our records, and if we have these forms, we'll give them to you. And again, so long as you can manage your farm according to the labels, you're good to go. If not, if you don't, we have a lot of land that does not have a determination on it. You'll fill out that form, and then we will give you a determination. And again, we'll give you that same set of products, the 026 we call it, map, and some other information to help you manage your farm accordingly. So, key thing, even if IDEM or DNR or U.S. Army Corps of Engineers comes out and says you don't have a wetland under our laws, you do still need to check with USDA before doing any work on your farm that could possibly get you in violation. So if you plan to do any drainage, filling, or clearing of a woods that does not have a determination, that's key. You don't have to ask every time, but if you do not have a determination, we want you to come in and make sure you're doing things to keep your eligibility good. If you're not familiar with your local Farm Service Agency, this process is initiated at the Farm Service Agency office, and that office is the one where you maintain your farm records. Most of you, if you've been participants for a while, you know where that is. If you are a new farmer or want to become a participant in USDA programs, never have before, you can find your local FSA Service Center just by putting in a web search Indiana Farm Service Agency office locator, and you'll come to this website, you click your county, and it'll tell you the address and phone number, and you can get to work with those helpful employees. And again, this is needed only, and these key factors number 2 and 3, if you're planting commodity crops on that land, and if you want to be a USDA program participant. If you want to, let's say, clear a woods to build a house, that does not fall under the Food Security Act. That may fall under Clean Water Act or state law. Again, you have to contact those agencies for that decision, but you would not even have to contact USDA so long as that's what you end up doing with that land and that conversion. Okay. All right. I mentioned the Form 1026. I just put it up here. And again, hopefully you've filled these out if you've been a program participant for a while. But again, it just asks you some very simple questions. Do you plan to create new drainage systems, so on and so forth, that has not been evaluated by NRCS? Again, if you have a map and a label and a form that tells you what those labels are, you can say yes or no. You say no because you do have a determination, right? So again, this form will walk you through your planned activities and help you decide if you need a new determination or if you're good to go with what you already have. All right. So let's say you do need a determination. So you filled out the form with the Farm Service Agency. They will give us a copy of that form, and then it goes to NRCS. And NRCS will be the one to make the wetland determination. If I haven't said it yet, we do work in strong partnership within USDA between NRCS and FSA. FSA does the administration part of the Food Security Act. We do the technical part of it. Okay, so you've asked USDA for determination through the Farm Service Agency. They will then get that information to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we will decide if that land is a wetland under the Food Security Act or not. The key here, and this is one thing that we really want to stress. If you've fallen asleep, please wake up just for this. It helps us immensely if you have records of the farm. And I'll show you why in a little bit, why that's so important. And I remember that key factor number 1, December 23, 1985. Any information you have on that land in question, whether that's old installation maps from tile or, engineering designs, construction reports, photos, aerial photos, maps, anything. If you've harvested trees off that land in the past and you have a lumber report from your forester, or even a forest management plan to list the species of trees that were in there, that will help immensely. Anything you have, even if you have, the old farmstead photos, most farms have them, good old picture of the farm and the barns, and maybe that land in question is still in that photo, and that was taken back in 1962. That photo may prove very helpful to help us make the right decision for your farm. Okay. So we have information that we will review, but any information you have pertinent to the farm, pertinent to that location, we're going to add that to our list of information, and we're going to come up with the right answer for you up front. The quicker we get this information up front, the better, more accurate decision we can help you make. Okay, it's really critical that you do your homework so that we can make the right decision for your farm. So we will review the information that we have in our case file and in our data sets, old aerial photos, things like that we have. We use a lot of what they call LiDAR, which is very precise elevation data. We use all this information to help make the decision, plus your information. Again, the information you have is so critical. We really need you to give that to us early in the process. So we'll make that decision. We may make a field visit if needed, and we'll get you the answer of whether you have a wetland that falls under the Food Security Act, or if you do not. We'll give you that map, that form, and all that with that label, and you can make that decision. Okay, I'm gonna hone in on this for just a little bit. That date, December 23rd, 1985. That comes into play when we are looking at that hydrology factor. Does the site have water to the point that is required as a wetland for the Food Security Act? And pretty much for the Food Security Act, and this is different than other laws. The Food Security Act requires a water table at or near the soil surface during the wet part of the growing season in most years. Okay. what that looks like, you can see here on your photo, this is a hole dug in an area. And after so long of a time, a couple hours or so, if there's hydrology on the site, if there's water on the site, that hole will fill up with water. And as you can see that here, that water is right at the soil surface. If we're in a not the wet part of the growing season, the early part of the growing season, we look for other indicators. You can see a photo here of a crawfish burrow. We have a whole set of indicators that all of our agencies use to help decide if that site could have been wet long enough in the early part of the growing season, even though it may be August when we're out there. Okay, so these are the clues that we look for. And again, if you think you may have a wetland on your farm, you can go out and look for these as well and maybe have a good idea of what your answer is going to be. Now, I mentioned that key factor number one, December 23rd, 1985. And this is one of the biggest differences between the USDA Food Security Act and other wetland laws. That date is very critical. That is the date that that USDA is attempting to decide, was it a wetland on December 23rd, 1985? Now, if you're good at math, you'll know that as of today, that was 13,023 days ago. That equates to over 35 plus years ago. That's a long time. So the law was enacted December 23rd, 1985. That's why that date is important. Congress enacted the law back then. They have not changed it since. They've amended it, but they have not changed it. So that is really critical. And that makes our job that much more tough, because every year that goes by is that much more memory and knowledge of that site that might go away. So that's why we need that information you have. You know, if you have, again, old photos, tile installation records, if you know there's a tile outlet somewhere that runs through there, we need that information to make the right decision. We're trying to look back 35 years ago to make the right decision for your farm. And what comes into play here is a concept we call best drained condition. Okay, so we have a data set of aerial photography from 1985, and that's where we start. We look at that site, your site in question, what it looked like in 1985 from the air. And if we can decide that it was capable of growing a crop on December 23rd, 1985, we can invoke what we call best drain condition through the Food Security Act. And what that means is we will assess the hydrology of the site as of 1985 based on evidence we find of the best drain condition. So for example, we've had farms where today it's fully wooded and it's wet. We look at the 1985 slide and there's no trees on the site. And it was capable, we make the decision it could have been capable of growing a crop. And then the farmer gives us an old aerial photograph from 1960 showing that it was obviously in crop production. That's best drain condition. Even though it's a woods today and it meets the definition of a wetland today, the Food Security Act allows us to go back to 1985 and say that land is decided now to be prior converted. And again, you get that label, you can manage that farm according to that prior converted label. If the site was not capable of growing a crop, and again, we make that decision based back in 1985, if there is woods on the site in 1985, or if we see obvious water, like a marsh. Okay, so either of those means that the best drain condition does not apply. And so when we look at the hydrology or the water of the site for your site today, we look at what the current condition is. Okay. But if it was woods in 1985,
Shannon, we're losing you just a little bit again.
very complicated.
Shannon,
That's
you
why
kind of cut out there just a bit. I don't know if you can hear me. You cut out there just the last few seconds.
So I got cut out again. Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yeah, coming back now.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so this is very complicated because we're trying to go back 35 years. And that's where that information that you have, that history that you have of the farm, helps us tremendously to make the right decision. Okay. Moving on. Again, this is just some examples of, old tile installation reports, old aerial photography. We do have a sheet that we put in our offices helping you understand that the more information you give us up front, the better decision we can make. So we want to help you help us, and we really need your help on these decisions to make sure we make the right one. Okay, so NRCS makes the determination. Here's what you'll get. Again, we talked about the form, the map, give you some informational sheets. Again, just because you have a wetland doesn't mean you can't manage that farm certain ways. The big key, again, I'll stress this again, if you're asleep, wake up. You cannot make that site capable of growing a crop. You can harvest trees. You can do stuff with that land, but if it becomes capable of growing a crop, that's when you may get in violation of the Food Security Act. Okay. So again, what that level looks like is site specific. There used to be an adage, cut the trees, but leave the stumps. That we no longer say that, because what if the stumps rot? Now you could grow a crop there. Okay. So it's up to you. You can manage your land the way you want. You just need to make sure that you could not grow a crop on that land with whatever you end up doing to it. Okay. If it's a wetland. If it's not a wetland, again, you can manage according to those labels. All right. So you've gotten the decision, and let's say you don't like the decision. Let's say NRCS called it a wetland, but you disagree. You think it's not a wetland. You do have a whole host of appeal rights available to you. And I'm not going to read these through. There's multiple levels of appeal to make sure that we have the right information and we made the right decision. Again, sometimes we make a decision and all of a sudden you found a very important document. Give that to us. We want to make sure that we have every piece of information on that farm that we can and make the right decision for you. Okay, so many levels of appeal. You will be given these in writing with your determination so that you can follow those, know who to call, and follow that process to make sure we get it right. All right, let's say you make a mistake. Let's say you clear a woods and you make it farmable, or you plant a crop on that land, and we find you in violation of the Food Security Act. There are ways to get back into the programs. Like I mentioned, once you violate these provisions, you are ineligible for USDA benefits, and you may have to pay back past benefits that you've received. This can add up to a lot of money. Trust us. We don't want to see this happen. But if you make a mistake, or maybe your operator makes a mistake, or your landowner makes a mistake, that will impact you and your Farm Bill program benefits. However, we do have a way to get you back into the programs. And again, hopefully we don't have to work with you on those, but if so, we will work with you. If you follow our processes that's required by law, we can reinstate your benefits. And then normally that requires restoring that land back to a wetland, or creating a new wetland on another location called mitigation. So we can work with you on this. Once that's done, we can reinstate your program benefits. Again, that's up to you, but we will work with you if that becomes a case on your farm. Okay, as I mentioned, the Food Security Act is different than the Clean Water Act and the Indiana state laws governing wetlands. So even if you get a decision from USDA that says you have prior converted cropland, or you have a non-wetland, or one of these other labels that does not have restrictions by the Food Security Act, that does not protect you against other laws that may have jurisdiction. Okay, so in your letter that you receive from us, it will have very strong language to encourage you to contact the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to make sure you're not going to be in violation of the Clean Water Act, and also contact information for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management and Indiana Department of Natural Resources to make sure you do not get in conflict with the Indiana state wetland laws. Okay, so just because you are not you are okay by the Food Security Act and you would be eligible for USDA benefits, we don't want you to get crosswise with other laws and have those penalties invoked on your farm either. Okay, so I want to make this very clear. We do work in concert as a partnership, but we do not have jurisdiction over any of those other laws. Neither do those other agencies have jurisdiction over our laws. So we can't speak for each other on anybody's behalf. Okay, so why are they different? Well, on the federal side, it's because Congress passed two different laws with two different purposes. Again, we've talked about the Food Security Act ad nauseum here, haven't we? It's about growing commodity crops, USDA programs, and that December 23, 1985 date is very important. Clean Water Act goes under the terminology waters of the U.S. And again, Sarah with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will go into more detail on that to help you understand those. Okay, but they are two separate laws, and neither agency speaks for the other. Okay. Again, and also if you're concerned about USDA being on your property to see if you have a wetland, we are required by law. We cannot share our information or your information on your farm with anybody else. We cannot share it with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, nor with any of the state agencies. Okay. However, if our information would help the Corps or the state agency in their work with their laws, you can give us permission to share that information. Again, if you want them to have the information that we collected on your farm, you can give that. We can give that to us in writing, and we can freely share that information with your written permission. Without that written permission, no other agency has access to your records. Okay. Again, we are different, and that's because of the laws. We're here to implement our law. Our partners are here to implement their laws. We can't speak for each other. However, we do work closely together. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we do share the same manuals. And we also do inform each other, or we inform you to make sure you contact those other agencies and entities to make sure you don't get crosswise with those wetland laws as well, even if you are in good shape with the Food Security Act. Okay. So with that, I want to thank you. Thank you for your patience. I apologize for, well, if I can't apologize, it's not my fault. It's the waves today making me cut out, but I do appreciate your attention. And Jeff, if there's any questions now, we can answer them. If you want to wait to the end, we can do that as well.
I did have a couple come in, Shannon, so I'll go ahead and do those while it's on people's minds. Could you clarify what you said about clearing of woods, but leaving the stumps because they may rot out? I know some folks have questions, and again, it's important to highlight that different strokes for different folks. You know, the laws apply differently in different situations, but for USDA purposes, could you clarify what you said about stump removal?
I sure will. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. You think, bear with me here. Walk with me through the time here. So you have a woods, and let's say we decide it is a wetland, but you want to harvest those trees, maybe to sell the lumber, maybe they're in your way of your center pivot, so on and so forth. So you want to cut the trees down. The Food Security Act does not prohibit you from cutting those trees down. Okay. So if you cut the trees down, but the stumps are still there, you can't farm that, right? So that you have not made the production of an agricultural commodity product possible. Now, if the trees don't grow back and the stumps rot away, and now that land might be capable of growing a crop, now you might be in violation of the Food Security Act. So the advice is, you can, if you want to cut trees down for whatever purpose, you just need to make sure that land does not become capable of growing a crop. Typically, if it's wet enough, it'd be too wet to grow a crop. But sometimes things dry out. You just have to make sure it cannot be capable of growing a crop. And that's up to you.
An important distinction there. It's not just that you do farm it if you remove the trees, it's whether the land becomes capable.
Correct.
Okay. So the caution there is removing the stumps could potentially make it capable and create a violation.
Yes.
Okay. One in the chat, how do you handle a situation where leased land changes hands, but the previous farmer converted the land?
I'll let my FSA counterparts answer that question if you don't mind. Stephanie or Kim?
Hi, yeah, this is Stephanie Alexander, and that is a good question. So my recommendation is if you cash front farms and you're picking up a new farm and you're not familiar with the determination, you should get notification anytime an operator changes land. You'll get a notification letter and a map of that farm that will have the indicator that it is a wetland. If you have some land that hasn't had a determination, we can do that for you. So your responsibility is, if you didn't convert it and you didn't have a prior planning violation, as long as you don't plant on that wetland area, then you're good. Your responsibility, I think, or the most important thing that you can do is picking up new farms, is just make sure you know what kind of land, you know, do you have a wetland? Do you have highly erodible? And just stay out of it. Just as long as you don't plant, then you will not be in violation. I hope that kind of answers that question.
Okay, and then one additional clarification on the stump question, Shannon. For 25 years or so, USDA told farmers it was okay to cut and leave the stumps. So just clarifying again, is that still the case? It's okay to cut the trees and leave the stumps?
Yes. However, that land cannot become capable of growing a crop.
Okay. And one more in the chat regarding drainage. A regulated drain flows through what is now deemed a potential wetland, likely only wetland because the drain field, the drain failed, excuse me. So a drain flows through what is now deemed potentially a wetland, likely only because the drain failed. We're being instructed we can no longer repair those. We have to go around the designated area. How would you approach this?
So that's a great question, and we deal with that a lot. And again, that comes back to that 1985 date. And that's where if it's a regulated drain, we assume that there's a very active county drainage board that has great records. The farmer, bring that to USDA. We can work with the drainage board, you and others, to decide what was the condition of that site in 1985. That's the kicker. If it was a wetland in 1985, then it is regulated, and we have to find a way to work around that to the drainage. Either work around the wetland or install non-perforated tile through it so that we don't drain the wetland itself. However, if there are records from the county drainage board that the tile was working back in 1985 and that site was not a wetland because it was drained by that tile, we will take that into consideration in our determination and may very well decide that as of 1985, it was not a wetland. So again, that's back to that key information. Whatever the farmer can get, whether it's from the drainage board, from their own records, give that to USDA so we can make the right decision on that. Sometimes it may still be a wetland, sometimes it may not, but it comes back to that 1985 date.
Okay, and I got one to me here. Can you make it? We talked a lot about converting wetlands, but what about prior converted wetlands to 1985 and planting crops on those acres? Still okay for prior converted prior to 1985? Still okay to plant those acres?
If you have a determination from USDA that says prior converted, then yes.
Okay.
If the land does not have a determination, again, we will look at that land as of 1985 and give you a label that you can manage accordingly.
Okay. And then in the chat again, how many farms are you making determinations on per year in Indiana? Is that number increasing or decreasing? You have an average on your workload from that standpoint?
That's a great question. This number may throw you for a loop. We do about 3,000 determinations a year. We've been doing this since 1985, and we still have that much land each year that does not have a determination on it. That number, it astounds me every time I look at it, but that's how many we do.
Okay, well, that's all we have in the chat or on the text for now. Of course, folks, we'll do Q&A at the end if we still have time. Would like now to pivot to Sarah Keller and the U.S. Army Corps for her presentation. So Shannon and his team will stick around if there are other questions to USDA, but I'll share my screen for Sarah's presentation.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Of course, I work for the Department of Defense, so they make everything a logistical hurdle, including being able to actually get on Zoom. So Jeff is helping me out today and driving my presentation for me. So Shannon said a lot of very important things. He did a really great job kind of doing part of my job for me today. He talked about the importance of wetlands, how to identify a wetland. So he mentioned wetland hydrology, hydrophytic vegetation, and wetland soils. We follow what we call the Wetland Delineation Manual from 1987, and we have regional supplements that we use in different regions of the country. We can't deviate from that process, whereas the USDA's process is a bit different. They may use the 87 manual, but unless Shannon can correct me, I don't believe they're required to. And the other difference between our regulations is that he said the 1985 Farm Bill hasn't changed since 1985. That's definitely not the case for the Clean Water Act. It's been a bit of a roller coaster for us since 2015, and the roller coaster continues. So I wanted to focus today a lot on what is the definition of a water in the US now, because it's changing so often now that I think it's important that everybody knows what our current definition is. I won't get too much into like permitting requirements or anything like that. Of course, you're free to ask the questions if you have them, but I'm just going to touch a little bit on this. My presentation has a lot more pictures in it just to give you examples of things that are and are not regulated under the current regulations. All right, Jeff, if you can move on.
Okay, so Sarah, just to make sure I'm in the right spot, I'm on your 4 categories.
Yeah,
And now-
slide 2 should be the 4 categories. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay. I didn't see it change on mine. It's still on the title slide.
Bear with me here.
There we go. All right, so we've got 4 categories now of waters of the US, or WOTUS is the fun name that people gave it now. So we've got their territorial seas and traditional navigable waters. You've got tributaries, lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters, and adjacent wetlands. And you'll see the category behind them, A1, A2, A3, A4. That's just how they're cited in the law. So if you see me mention A2 waters in another slide or something, it means tributaries. All right, Jeff. So territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, gave you some local examples here. We have a list. It's for the Army Corps of Engineers. It's anything subject to jurisdiction under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. There is a list on every Corps district website over which waters are considered traditional navigable waters. In the case of Lake Michigan, it actually has a tide. And that's what makes that one automatically a traditional navigable water, because there's actual tidal influence. All right, Jeff. All right, tributary. I'm not going to read all this to you guys, but I wanted to show you that there is a very distinct definition of what tributaries mean in our newest regulations. And it basically, the take home here is that your tributaries can be modified, they can be ditched. We all know that a lot of things in Indiana have the name ditch in it, but if it used to be a stream that was just manipulated, or it relocated a stream or something like that, it could still be a tributary, but it must have perennial or intermittent flow in a typical year. So if we got a significant drought, that's not a typical year. So we're kind of throwing out these weird climate things that are happening right now. And again, just because you move a stream around doesn't make it not a water of the US. And there are other kind of limitations, but for the most part, it's pretty clear cut. Intermittent or perennial flow. And Jeff, you can move to the next one. We're not going to talk about that. Perennial flow means it flows continuously year round. Intermittent means you're probably going to have little pools of water in the channel. Sometimes it might completely dry up in extreme weather circumstances. But again, we're not going to evaluate these tributaries in extreme circumstances. We're going to try to find what's typical. Ephemeral means it only flows right after it rains. It's going to be dry the rest of the time. All right, Jeff. So here's a couple examples. The one on the left is alongside a road, and that is actual perennial stream. It's been ditched, it's been relocated, it's been modified, but it flows year round. but it does not look great, but it is technically a tributary. The one on the right is a more natural example of a perennial stream. All right, Jeff. And then from there, like I said, that's intermittent perennial, pretty self-explanatory. I'll have some other examples later on. So for lakes, ponds, and impoundments, again, I just threw this in here. It's from the rule just to show you very specific criteria here. So an impoundment of a jurisdictional water, it means somebody built a dam in a jurisdictional stream, and they've created a pond. Other lakes and ponds, some of you get in northern Indiana, you've got natural lakes that would be jurisdictional. Down here, you've got a lot more dammed up situations. And there are a couple different ways they could be jurisdictional. Again, you could dam up a jurisdictional tributary or wetland in some cases. In other cases, it could be a pond that gets flooded by, let's say, Ohio River, an extreme example, Ohio River or something like that. If it gets flooded in a typical year, we could also take jurisdiction over that in that case. All right, Jeff. Here's a recent example it's actually a local example of an impoundment of a jurisdictional water. So this was an intermittent stream that was dammed up, and I think just for recreational purposes, but it impounded the water. So we're taking jurisdiction over the stream, the impoundment itself, the pond, and right up there at the upslope tip, a wetland formed. And we would take jurisdiction over that. I'll get into wetlands in the next slides. All right, Jeff. So wetlands. So they changed the definition of adjacent wetland. And as you can see on here, again, this is from our regulations. So it's very specific. To be a regulated wetland under the Clean Water Act, it has to abut, and then which means to touch on one side. They can be flooded by a tributary. Again, that tributary has to be jurisdictional. The tributary would have to flood into the wetland, not the reverse. It doesn't matter if the wetland flows into the tributary. That's not what the rule is looking at. We are only looking at water from this tributary into the wetland to make it jurisdictional. Wetlands can also be adjacent if they're physically separated by a tributary or a jurisdictional pond. But let's say in the example of a levee, if it's physically separated by that artificial structure, there has to be a pump, a culvert, or something else that allows that direct hydrologic connection. If there's not, it's not jurisdictional, even though it's right next door to that tributary. Okay, Jeff, go ahead. All right, and I did just recall that Shannon mentioned something about identifying wetlands under the FSA. Just pointing out a little bit of a difference that I noted in the program. He said that they require inundation at or near the surface. And he had that picture of that soil pit filled with water. The Corps' 1987 manual, our hydrology requirement is only saturation in the upper 12 inches. So we don't necessarily have to have that pooled water in your hole. Our hydrology requirement is a much lower bar. So just wanted to point that out as one of those differences. So here's some examples of adjacent wetlands. The one on, there we go. Can you go back a slide? There we go. So the one on the left, it's a little bit grainy, but that is a skunk cabbage wetland that you can tell runs directly up to the edge of that stream. That's an intermittent stream in this case. And then the one on the right is an actual impoundment. And this wetland, it's an impoundment of a tributary, so the pond itself is regulated. And this wetland formed around the edge of the pond. So that is an adjacent wetland. All right, Jeff. All right. And then this is another example. Again, an A2 water is just a regulated tributary. It's surrounded by wetland in this case. So all that dark, wet kind of looking area, that's all wetland. So that's adjacent because it runs right up to the edge. The one on the right is what you're going to see up in the Lake Michigan area. They've got sand dunes up there. So a sand dune is a natural barrier. Yeah, it's a natural barrier. So you see all those wet areas in the lower part of the picture. That's all what we call dune swale wetlands. And there's only a single dune separating those wetlands from Lake Michigan. So that now if you had a series of dunes, the only jurisdictional ones would be behind the initial first dune. Rest of them are not. All right, Jeff. Again, another example, the one on the left, there's a levee system there. It's surrounded by wetlands. We're making an assumption here that it's physically separated by an artificial barrier, that there's a levee. In this case, again, there has to be pipes or pumps for those wetlands to be jurisdictional. If they're, or in the case on the right side, you've got a flooded tributary and it's flooding wetlands on the other side of the levee. So on the left, we're making the assumption that there's culverts or pipes or something that's still allowing that hydrology. On the right, we're looking at direct inundation by flooding, which is the other way that you can have a jurisdictional wetland. All right, next. Another local example here. This is an intermittent tributary. It doesn't look like much. This used to be, as you can see in the aerial on the right, used to be a pond. Somebody impounded it many, many years ago. The dam breached many, many years ago, and the stream is trying to reestablish itself through all the sediment from the old pond. So wetlands have developed there. They met all three criteria. So that is both a tributary and a regulated tributary and an abutting wetland. So it's adjacent in this case. Okay, so, and just a quick, like I said, I didn't want to get into the weeds of the permitting, but just what triggers our involvement as far as needing a permit is anytime you discharge fill material. So basically, if you move dirt, this is a little oversimplification, but if you move dirt or put down material, any material, rock, stone, you name it, you probably need to talk to one of us about that. Okay, so what are excluded from regulation? Things we don't regulate. We've got 12 categories. Personally, I love the fact that B1 is basically anything that's not on the rest of the list. So I'm not sure why they started with that instead of putting it at the end, but that's the way it is. All right, Jeff, move on. So key elements of exclusions, we don't regulate upland. Upland is dry land. There's no wetland there. There's no potential tributary there. So some of these ag ponds for cattle watering and stuff like that, a lot of them were constructed in agricultural land that never was a tributary or ditch or wetland or anything like that. So that's a good example. Anything constructed in dry land would not be regulated regardless of what it is now. So the key is, though, you may have an excluded feature, it may potentially serve as a connection for something else. But if it's excluded, like for example, a pond or something, if we call that feature excluded, it will never require a permit. It just might serve as a connection for something else upslope. So one of our most popular categories, the B1, like I said, is B1 is everything that doesn't meet any of the other 11. And then B2 is groundwater. We've never regulated groundwater. We never will. But they felt it necessary to kind of emphasize that in the new regulations. All right, next. So one popular item under B1 that you're going to see are isolated wetlands. Non-adjacent wetlands. Then I threw out just a couple of local examples here. You got a wetland in the middle of a cropland here. And on the right, you've got a wetland and it kind of slopes down directly to a perennial tributary. It's real close. That wetland is maybe 20 feet away, but it doesn't matter because it does not touch the tributary and it does not flood. The tributary does not flood that wetland. So that is a case of a non-adjacent or isolated wetland. So this is one of the categories we use the most in Indiana. All right, here's another example. Again, another very local, very recent example. There is a intermittent stream This is just from my little snapshot from my phone. So you can see on the left, the aerial in which direction I'm looking in the picture on the right. Again, this was cropland, but you can tell it just pools water right there, and the farmer just cannot get crops successfully grown there. It is real close to that tributary. This one is maybe 10 feet away, but that tributary does not flood this wetland, and this wetland does not directly touch that tributary. So it is non-adjacent or isolated. All right, next. All right, other categories. The other popular one we're using right now, B3, ephemeral features. So there's where our ephemeral streams come in. Swales, we got grassy swales on a lot of cropland. Gullies, rills, and pools. All right, so guys, gullies, rills, and pools are like the erosional things. You see it from like loose dirt. You know, we've never regulated that. We never will. Again, ephemeral streams could be connections for certain things, but they themselves are not regulated and never require a permit under the Clean Water Act. B4, you're never going to see this one. I mean, this is just stormwater runoff. It's like the water that flows over your field. We don't regulate it. Right, next. Here's a couple examples of ephemeral features, the B3 exclusion. The one on the left is a stream. It is an ephemeral stream. It only flows right after a rainfall. The one on the right is a swale. It's kind of hard to see, but it's a swale that's going through a fallow pasture. And it just kind of holds water a little bit, but only after a rain. All right, ditches. Again, a lot of things in Indiana have the name ditch in it. Doesn't mean it's not a tributary. We've always done quite a hefty job at draining excess water off a field so that we can put everything into crop production. So in the process, over decades, maybe even centuries, streams got modified, relocated, things like that. So your ditch is not jurisdictional if they were constructed in dry land. So if they did not capture or relocate a tributary, or they were not constructed in a wetland, then they would not be regulated. Okay, here's an example. This one is a little bit odd. It's not the typical kind of ag ditch that we see. We end up having to do a lot of forensic science. Like Shannon mentioned how helpful it is to have all your farm records for the FSA determination. Similar for us, we feel like we do a lot of forensic science here. This was submitted to me. In the aerial, you will see a wooded area directly to the east. There is a tributary in there. So I looked at this going, oh, maybe this is just part of a tributary. It is not. We had aerial records, historic records showing that this thing was actually excavated in the middle of this field and not from any kind of drainage feature or wetland or anything like that. So although it looks, you know, forested and stuff like that, we had clear records that showed that it was an excluded ditch and not a water of the US. And since it was the same side, I went ahead and threw in 2 more examples of isolated wetlands, and you can see them on the map where they lay in the field. All right. Prior converted cropland. This is where we're kind of tiptoeing with the FSA here. So you'll notice that all important date that Shannon kept mentioning, December 23rd, 1985. But nowhere in here do you see Food Security Act, Farm Bill, or anything like that. So what our regulations are doing is basically telling us that they're defining prior converted cropland under the Clean Water Act. Again, it's not FSA, this is Clean Water Act, but the intent here is to stop being redundant with all of these, the government oversight, I guess. So in a nutshell, if you can provide me a copy of the FSA determination that says this spot, although it's wetland, it's prior converted cropland. And if you got an FSA determination, that's the fastest way to have me tell you, okay, you need no permit for that. And that's where Shannon said that we can share information if you fill out a form that authorizes the USDA to share information with the Corps. Otherwise, we cannot get it. I cannot call up USDA on a landowner and say, hey, I need so-and-so's determination. They cannot share it. All right, other exclusions. We've got artificially irrigated areas. We've got some areas in Indiana that do artificial irrigation for certain crops, but really we don't have a lot of like rice farming around here, guys. So we don't come across this. Artificial lakes and ponds kind of speaks for itself. It's a lake and pond, again, for irrigation, stock watering, stuff like that, constructed in dry land. That's the key here. It's not an impoundment of a stream or a wetland or anything like that. So as long as it's constructed in dry land, it's not regulated. Same thing for B9. B9 is things like gravel quarries or other mining operations. Those quarries are not jurisdictional. All right. Okay. Stormwater features. So kind of, again, speaks for itself. If you've got B10 and B11 are meant to address detention ponds, retention ponds. If you've constructed wetlands for the purpose of, rain gardens or other things to kind of slow down runoff off of a parking lot, things like that. This one just calls out the fact that these were artificially constructed for these purposes. We're not going to regulate them. B12 waste. Oh, go ahead, sir. B12 waste treatment systems. We're talking, waste treatment lagoons and things like that. We never have regulated those, and we never will under Section 404. Okay, so this is what our wonderful approved jurisdictional determination form. So if you want us to be able to go out on your property and say, yeah, you have a wetland, officially, no, we're not regulating this. In order to get that official letterhead confirmation, this is the form that the Corps project managers have to fill out. You as a landowner do not fill this out. This is the Corps' job. We can do it. But this is what we have to use in order to document every ditch, tributary, wetland, any potential water on your site. We'll put it on here, and we will give a clear explanation as to why it is or is not regulated. So again, this does not replace the FSA determination process. So, and we will say that in any approved jurisdictional determination letter. We have a paragraph we throw in there that clearly states you need to contact the USDA for farm bill determinations. We also include paragraphs in there when you have isolated wetlands. We instruct you to contact the state to see if your wetlands are potentially regulated under state law. The AJD process is completely optional, and you're not required to do this. Some people, I have a lot of people that have farms and they just want to run a tile through an area, and they might literally call me up and video me and give me a virtual tour of their farm. And usually by doing that, sometimes I can say, no, you're high and dry, you're good. And they're happy with that. Other people want that warm and fuzzy letter. So if you want the letter, we have to go through the more formal process. So if you do get that JD, again, this is optional. If you do get that JD, which tells you which features on your property are either regulated or not regulated, then if you decide you need to impact it for some reason, then we can get into the permitting process. If you don't want to waste the time with the jurisdictional determination process, we can skip straight to permitting, but then you assume everything on your property is jurisdictional, any aquatic feature, swales, ditches, things like that. Again, non-federally jurisdictional waters may be subject to regulation items, state isolated wetland law, and we will advise you of that. Also, another caveat, we've got DNR. They have their own authority under the Flood Control Act, and they have nothing to do with the Clean Water Act. So they're their own separate regulatory identity here. All right, and as I mentioned, right now it seems to be a roller coaster for the Clean Water Act. We're going through a lot of changes. So the new administration on June 9th issued a Federal Register notice proposing the intention of changing the definition of waters of the US again. They're going to follow the same process that the Trump administration did. So the first regulation will be the quote step 1 rule, and step 1 rule will return us back to what we were doing in the 1986 regulations, basically what we were doing before 2015. Those of you who have been around probably are familiar with the term significant nexus. That will bring us back to that realm. And then the step 2 regulation will be the actual change of the definition of waters of the US. They have not talked to us about any of those potential definition changes. I have no specific information on that yet. I can tell you that if this is following the same rulemaking procedure that all the other administrations have, that step 1 rule is not likely to appear for at least a couple of years. So as of right now, we're expecting to follow what I just presented to you today for the next couple of years. If you want to stay up to date on those proposed changes, I put EPA's website on there. They are the administrator of the Clean Water Act and therefore in charge of all of these rule changes. The Corps is the boots on the ground that actually, makes it happen. So, all right, and I think at this point, here's my contact information. And again, this was kind of just a brief overview of what we're regulating right now. Absolutely reach out to me anytime you want. Email is probably the easiest because I both telework and work in the office. So email is often the fastest way to get a hold of me. You can just say, hey, call me, and I'll do that. Or you can leave a voicemail for me at my office number and I'll call you back.
Okay, and of course, we've got their contact information as well, and happy to share that. Thank you, Sarah. We'll jump to a couple questions on the chat that came in. Of course, are the slides going to be made available? Sarah, I don't know if you're at liberty to share those.
Yes,
USDA.
I can absolutely share these presentations. Yep.
Okay, super, and we can get those to you folks. Why did Congress write laws that protect wetlands? So maybe kind of the background on where the Clean Water Act comes from.
Yeah, so prior to 1972, a lot of us were probably familiar or have seen pictures of rivers on fire, most notably like the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland. It was so polluted because industries were developing so rapidly, they just wanted a quick way to dump their waste. And that's what they did. They just started dumping their waste in all these rivers and wetlands, and they were so polluted, they were catching fire. So Congress decided in 1972, they enacted the first reiteration of the Clean Water Act to try to protect these resources because it was scary. These are the same rivers we were using as our drinking water sources that were catching fire. And it was evident that these industries didn't see the bigger picture here, and they were threatening our clean water is what it was getting. They weren't doing it on their own to protect these waters. The government basically had to step in and say, hey, look, we need to control all this output of industrial pollution. And they acknowledge that wetlands are also critical for treating water. They found out that, they call wetlands nature's kidneys for a reason, because it allows water to infiltrate the ground. All the crud, so to speak, gets filtered through the ground, and then the water goes back to your groundwater table, your aquifer, and comes out as clean water. It also helps a lot with flooding and stuff like that. But I think the original intent here was we need clean water. We have to drink this stuff.
And we had a question on how do I contact my local Army Corps office?
Me. I work here in Indianapolis. I've got 4 colleagues. We are located on the northeast side at Fort Bend. So I can always provide you our address if you need to stop in. I'll just caution you with COVID restrictions right now. We're kind of at the mercy of what the Pentagon tells us. So at any point, we may have to close the office to the public. As of right now, we're okay. That's why I recommend emails or phone calls. And then if you do have to come in for a meeting or something, we can arrange that.
Super. Well, that's all we had in the chat. I have none coming in to, oh wait, I think I did have one. So this may be USDA. Could you address burying streams with large tile? Is this a USDA violation?
Could you repeat that, Jeff?
Yeah, could you address burying streams with large tile? Is that a violation?
Al, if you're on, could you address that?
Yes, I can address that. It would depend, first for us, it would depend on whether we would decide that the stream is a wetland or not. And that would depend on, for us, for the Food Security Act, whether there's vegetation in the stream or not. Our decision-making process can get complicated fairly quickly. But if it's an actual stream with moving water, no vegetation in it, then we actually don't have jurisdiction over that. So we don't have any authority as to what happens with that. And this is why we go to such lengths to let the person know that they may need to talk with the Corps of Engineers or the other state agencies, because that's something that they may be concerned about. If you're putting tile into one of their jurisdictional waters, that certainly appears like it might need a permit. So
Absolutely, Al, you're spot on.
okay. So, but as far as we're concerned, yeah, if you're burying the tile deep enough, yeah, you're probably creating cropland. But if you've got a determination from us that it's a non-wetland or an artificial wetland, or it's prior converted, then you can go ahead and bury the tile in the ditch or the stream and crop over it. But sounds like we're not your concern. Somebody else is.
Yeah, I think the other take home here is that the Farm Bill comes into play here when you want it to. So if you want to participate in the program, it's a completely voluntary process. The Clean Water Act is not voluntary. It's a regulation that applies to absolutely everybody, and there's no geographic boundary. So we regulate waters of the U.S. regardless of where they are, even on private property.
The other thing that this question brought up would be for us is, what if the county drainage board wants to do this? Because they're improving their drainage systems now. They're going back in with a much bigger tile that they'll use that instead of the ditch, so they don't have to keep doing ditch maintenance. We actually don't have any jurisdiction over what the county drainage board does, because they're not in the program. So we really don't care. Where we do get involved is if the drainage board decides to do something that drains a wetland, then we would put a label on it that it's a converted wetland, and anybody that's in the programs would need to stay off of that and would not be able to crop it, even though it's now dry and is capable of being cropped. It's because somebody else drained it. You're still obligated to treat it as if it were a wetland, so you would need to stay off of it. So that comes up quite a bit.
And that goes to a question that popped up in the chat. How can local government enforce wetlands law, or do they? And maybe explain your interactions with local units of government.
Yeah, so we work pretty closely with local government. We understand that a lot of the local government has various laws that we may not be attuned to, like floodplain regulations, things like that. But a lot of times, if there's concerns about any kind of activities that's occurring and they're concerned that it might be a violation of Clean Water Act, they can report those to us. We have these complaint forms on our website, and then we'll look into that to see if it does look like a violation or not. We have a separate enforcement branch that does that kind of investigation. So that's probably the most interaction we have regarding enforcement of wetland laws.
And Sarah, I don't have this question, but because it came up when USDA was speaking, maybe one more time, go over what you called B6, prior converted cropland, maybe make that distinction, discuss that one more time.
Yeah, actually, I just gotten a text from somebody who knows my personal number saying, "Hey, you forgot to mention something." So yeah, so prior converted cropland, again, that all important date, December 23rd, 1985. And so if there is a prior converted cropland determination from the Food Security Act, from the USDA, then that falls under that B6 exclusion. There is one little note that I forgot to mention. It stays excluded unless it's abandoned. So under our regulations, abandonment is that they have done absolutely no attempt. It either it hasn't been farmed or not in support of agricultural activities for at least 5 years. So if we find out that like they just let the thing in, and we're not talking like fallowing a field or something like that. We're talking you legit just stopped operations for 5 years. That would be considered abandonment, and potentially then if you have a wetland or on that site, and potentially it could be subject to regulation.
So let's make that intersection while we have both agencies here. Shannon, you mentioned I think the example was if a tile drain has collapsed or is broken, and it maybe a wetland exists by virtue of that. If the records reflect that it was prior converted, your agency can permit that person, allow that person to then farm that. And Sarah, it sounds like in the case of abandonment, there may be some tension there where USDA might say we can show records that it was farmed at the time, but maybe if it becomes abandoned under the Clean Water Act, maybe not, maybe can't go forward with cropping that.
Well, and I say potentially regulated. Again, and this is where we accept data from wherever, wherever somebody wants to give us data to show that it wasn't abandoned, for 5 years. But even if I say it's potentially subject, all I mean is that we can't use the B6 exclusion. So let's face it, I mean, most of Indiana is pretty flat. So if you've got a wetland that's formed in this, prior converted area, then, and I say wetland by, Clean Water Act standards, if it has formed and it can't fall under that PCC exclusion under the Clean Water Act, it still may fall under a different exclusion. It could be an isolated wetland, for example, under B1. I'm just saying we can't use that B6 exclusion anymore. We'd have to then look at the other one to see if it falls into that. And
Okay.
again, I mean, the bar's set real low on, these wetlands have to be directly adjacent to streams. And then most of these tiles aren't going to be right next to streams. So except for the outfalls. So in a lot of cases, they'd probably still be excluded.
Okay, well, I don't see any new questions in the chat or by text. We've got a few minutes remaining, but so last call for questions here. In the meantime, do want to say thanks to our guests, Sarah with Army Corps, Shannon and Albert, Kim and Stephanie with USDA. Appreciate your time today and willingness to participate in this panel for our members and others. Yeah, somebody asked me to post Sarah's contact information. Let me just do that quickly again. So there's Sarah's information on the screen.
There was a new question that popped up on chat. Just because I happen to be in here looking, it says, how does the new Indiana law, Senate Bill 389, impact any of these agencies' regulations? The short of it, it does not, because we are federal regulations, and that new Senate bill is specifically on isolated wetlands, and that will be next week's presentation.
Yeah.
Same answer for us. We're very much looking forward to next week's presentation, so we can find out what's going on. But the short answer is we have nothing to do with that, and that's just the way the laws are being written. It is regrettable that the different legislatures can't get together and work to give more commonality to these things than they have. but that's just the lay of the land.
I also see another question in here that we missed. Got a question that says, what happens to B6 farm? Or what happens when B6 farms turn into development? I'm guessing you mean like prior converted, like excluded under that B6 prior converted cropland exclusion. You're saying what happens if it turns into development? It's not farmed anymore. As far as the Clean Water Act goes, in these newest regulations, they eliminated what we used to call change in use. We used to not regulate prior converted cropland, except for when they changed use and were going to be something other than agricultural. Then it was potentially subject to permitting. But in these newest regulations, it's absolutely the only thing in here is abandonment. There is no change of use requirement on that.
And for everybody's information, the word abandonment means something completely different for the Food Security Act. So again, they weren't cross-referencing the two agencies when they were creating these laws.
Okay, well, we knew we wouldn't answer every question. There are probably others that were not asked. Part of today was to make sure you knew we had assembled these resources that you can come to us with these questions, and we can either direct you to these folks or answer them here internally. So we want you to know that as a resource for you, Indiana Farm Bureau can pull together this kind of program and these kinds of folks to get you pointed in the right direction when the time comes. So we're at the end of our time this morning. Join us again next week, 8 to 9:30, where we'll feature guests from the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, Indiana Department of Natural Resources, to talk about state-regulated wetlands and waterways compliance based on some of the changes that came up in Senate Enrolled Act 389. So thank you, and thank you again for joining us. We appreciate your time today. Have a good one.